Let the joyous news be spread, the wicked old witch at last is dead. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Witch, oh witch, the wicked witch. Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead.
Well, this is a headline I've seen a few times a year for more than half a decade now. So you can forgive me if I'm still planning to take this news with a huge grain of salt, at least until it's really real. But this time, it certainly looks real. This time, more reputable publications are reporting on Kathleen Kennedy's exit from Lucasfilm, and as far as I've seen, there aren't any outright refutations of the news. So assuming this is real, for one brief moment at least, the galaxy far, far away is shining a little bit brighter today. Now, the Star Wars brand has been cast down into an abyss so deep and dark over the last decade that you can't even recognize it anymore. So while this is one of the best pieces of news Star Wars fans could have ever hoped to hear, it's merely a drop in the bucket of what it'll take to return the franchise to something resembling its former glory. And I don't want to rain on this wonderful parade, but for reasons I'll discuss later, we're nowhere near out of the woods yet. Now, if you somehow missed the joyous news, this is the headline that's been flying above the Star Wars galaxy for the last 24 hours. Kathleen Kennedy expected to retire from Lucasfilm. This news broke on Puck and was picked up by The Hollywood Reporter on the 24th. And this article already had me laughing by the time I reached the subheadline because it says that Kennedy presided over the Star Wars and Indiana Jones franchises through ups and downs since 2012. Now I know what you're thinking because I thought the same thing. Where exactly were the ups? Well, your guess is as good as mine. But the article continues, as it outlines Kennedy's achievements as head of Lucasfilm, most of which were outright failures, before mentioning her work as a producer prior to taking over Lucasfilm. But of course, the main thing to take away from the report is that the Wicked Witch is dead, and Kathleen Kennedy will finally be leaving her post by the end of the year. So that's the news that's being heavily celebrated all across the galaxy. Now, to say that Kennedy's exit from Lucasfilm is a long time coming is an understatement. Regardless of her resume before taking the helm, her list of abject failures at the head of one of the most popular franchises of all time is one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen. And that's coming from someone who's survived reviewing Amelia Perez, Velma, The Rings of Power, The Wheel of Time, Halo, and most of the other abominations that have popped up over the last few years. In the macro, Kathleen Kennedy squandered billions upon billions of dollars worth of fans' goodwill. She made Star Wars media nearly irrelevant, something that was thought to be impossible a decade ago. Shows like The Acolyte and Skeleton Crew often failed to chart in terms of viewership, as even the most fervent Star Wars fans simply tuned out. Legendary characters from the Star Wars universe were dredged up and put on screen just so Kennedy's movies, shows, books, and comics could absolutely destroy their legacies and humiliate them. Kennedy had an awful vision for the sequel trilogy, an entire era of the Star Wars timeline full of trash characters, horrible lessons and messages, and terribly planned stories that people have basically no interest in. And yet that trilogy's execution was somehow even worse than Kennedy's awful vision, and that's a point that really shouldn't be understated. They began a $750 million trilogy without a plan. Without fucking storyboarding the 3 movies ahead of time. That's just wild. That screw up on its own would have seen anyone who wasn't under some special protection axed on the spot. Yet Kennedy rode that wave of failure to multiple contract extensions. She denied reality, lambasted fans, and put her legacy and her agenda above honoring a lauded, beloved franchise and just telling good stories. Kennedy made every wrong decision possible along the way, and when she and Disney were faced with backlash from the fans, they doubled down on everything they were doing wrong. They're still forging ahead on a Rey movie that can't even get off the ground. And she spent time, effort, and money pursuing the idea of Taika Waititi and Rian Johnson making Star Wars movies, two people that seemingly have no interest in making Star Wars movies at this point. Speaking of which, Kennedy had not one, but two trilogies fall through on her watch, with Rian Johnson's trilogy waiting in purgatory, and another cancelled trilogy that was to be helmed by Game of Thrones creators D.B. Benioff and David Weiss. Two other movies also got shelved, with Patty Jenkins' Rogue Squadron film being indefinitely delayed, and Donald Glover's Lando deal having nothing to show for it 5 years later. And that's to say nothing of the litany of shows that also never came to fruition. Kennedy also has the inglorious distinction of overseeing the release of the only Star Wars movie to ever lose money. And while Solo's failure is largely the fault of The Last Jedi, all of it happened on her watch. She's going to be leaving Star Wars with a 7-year gap between films. So we're far, far away from the promise of a Star Wars movie every year. And Kennedy was at a minimum complicit in the firing of a Star Wars actress for a vaguely political post, while taking no action against an actor who posted a far worse, far more targeted political statement. Even Star Wars video games have suffered during Kennedy's tenure. During what used to be called the dark times of Star Wars, fans could at least rely on a steady stream of Star Wars games that were often bangers and helped keep fans' love for the Star Wars universe burning. Now, those fans are lucky to get one game release a year, and sometimes that release is something like Star Wars Outlaws. And the exciting releases they tease then get delayed and quietly fade into oblivion, never to be talked about again. The only major Star Wars bright spots during Kennedy's time in charge are really just Rogue One, Andor, and the release of Disney Plus with The Mandalorian. There were some smaller wins with things like The Clone Wars, Tales of the Jedi, and the like, but Kennedy's involvement in those major victories and the smaller ones is tenuous at best. Kennedy's failures even went beyond Star Wars. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was one of the most resounding flops in recent memory, but Kennedy just had to trot out Harrison Ford's decrepit old ass for one last adventure to destroy the character's legacy before the actor dies. Even Willow, of all things, was revived just to make a mockery of that poor old IP. When you take a full accounting of everything Kathleen Kennedy has fucked up in her time at the head of Lucasfilm, it's just truly astounding. Everything Kennedy touched turned to shit. There is no denying, however, that Kennedy boasts an extremely impressive resume over the entirety of her career. She worked on the Back to the Future trilogy, the good Indiana Jones movies, E.T., Goonies, Gremlins, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, and many, many others. She's been a Hollywood mainstay and produced more than 70 films, many of which were extremely successful. But the vast majority of those were all made working under and in conjunction with others. When she was given full control of the SS Lucasfilm, however, Kennedy somehow managed to navigate the ship right over a waterfall in the middle of the open ocean. And just as impossible as it is to find a waterfall in the middle of the open ocean to even go over, not long ago it would have been seen as just as impossible for one person to fuck up Star Wars this royally. Simply put, Kathleen Kennedy oversaw the darkest 13-year period in Star Wars history. And that's a history that includes decades without a single Star Wars film release and the negative reception the prequel trilogy faced. Make no mistake though, Kennedy will go down as a Hollywood legend. She will get her star on the Walk of Fame. But in the end, when Kathleen Kennedy had full control of things, she failed spectacularly, and that's how I and many, many others will remember her. Now, as positive as this news is for Star Wars, don't get caught wearing rose-colored glasses. Don't pop the cork on that blue milk just yet. Kathleen Kennedy making her much-awaited exit doesn't magically undo her 13-year tenure at the head of Lucasfilm. She hasn't been complacent in her time there. This whole time, she's been hiring people and training them and sculpting them in her image. People who likely think the way she thinks and who see things the way she sees things. People who have bought into her vision. Also, she still has until the end of the year to screw even more things up, as she'll likely look to secure her legacy in some deplorable fashion. And we don't even know who will take over her evil throne yet. And all of that is to say nothing of all the projects that are already set in motion. The Star Wars movie schedule for the next 4 years is already set. All the planning and these production cycles take so long that it takes years for Hollywood to course correct. So not to be the bearer of bad news, but over the next few months with Kennedy leaving, her replacement possibly being named, and the return of Andor, you're going to see a resurgence of Star Wars optimism that the franchise is still years away from deserving, assuming it even continues on this positive trajectory. Yes, this is the best day Star Wars has had in a long time, but we're still deep in the woods here. I've been a Star Wars fan since I was 6 years old, ever since I was old enough to understand what I was watching. So Star Wars has been near and dear to my heart for decades, and it's always been my favorite fantasy IP. But with what Kennedy's Lucasfilm and Disney have done to this franchise over the last 13 years, yesterday's news doesn't even bring me and people like me a sense of cautious optimism. And that's just a sad testament to how deep a hole Kennedy and her ilk dug for Star Wars. Kathleen Kennedy was such an obvious problem for Lucasfilm, but she was so entrenched, so accomplished, and so female that she couldn't be removed. Anyone else would have been publicly fired and disgraced years ago. But at least now, mercifully, it looks like her reign of terror is finally coming to an end. After everything she's done, though, her seemingly being allowed to retire of her own accord is far better than she deserves. What was your reaction to the Wicked Witch's long-delayed demise? How long ago do you think Emperor Kathleen Kennedy should have been dethroned? What other steps would Lucasfilm and Disney have to take to win you back as a fan? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to HateWatchers for reviews of current shows and movies. Thank you for praying that Kathleen never somehow returns with us today, and we'll catch you on the next one.